Hello everyone, welcome back to my labyrinth. So I've been working on an essay to really dig into our current political and cultural situation, to analyze kind of what brought us here, what brought us to a second term of Trump, for example. And I wanted to do it without just rushing out the predictable take, because I feel like many of the quick takes after the election were very predictable when it came to the kind of more liberal media. Pundits were very predictable, and it's just dry takes that are just not getting at the heart of the issue and what caused something like this and what caused this cultural shift. And I believe the left needs a serious reframing. It has to face some hard truths. What I'm reading and listening to from many of the leading kind of liberal pundits and political pundits, for example, suggests kind of a real avoidance of these truths that I want to get into. And I do want to say, no, I don't think the solution is a left-wing Joe Rogan. I see that headline everywhere. And no, I don't think Harris's loss can simply be chalked up to racism or sexism. And no, I don't think it's because of wokeness. And also, no, I don't think it's not just that Democrats left the working class behind. It's just these are things that are just not getting at it. There's complexity here and multiple layers to unpack, and I want to unpack them. But one major point I see is that the internet and the media are shaping the public's cultural shifts far more than I think they're willing to admit or even acknowledge, for that matter. So while the answer for the left, I think, isn't to create some kind of progressive Joe Rogan, it is worth noting that during Trump's celebration speech, figures, like Aiden Ross and the Nelk Boys, they got shout outs from Dana White, the head of the UFC.
I want to thank some people real quick. I want to thank the Nelk Boys, Aiden Ross, Theo Vaughn, Bustin' with the Boys, and last but not least, the mighty and powerful Joe Rogan.
That tells us, I think, a lot about just how influential the media has become and how it can mobilize this kind of cultural shift, right? And these are just some of my thoughts on the liberal response to the election. And as usual, I just think they're just missing the mark. And maybe not entirely, but even when they get close, they still seem to miss something fundamental. And I want to dig into that missing element because I think it's very important. And today, Sam Harris will be our kind of liberal case study because he seems to, in his little episode called The Reckoning that I have clips from, he almost hit every liberal talking point that just still at the foundation, at the heart of his argument, just completely misses the mark. Because in my view, I think it's the Democrat Party's centrist faction that has sidelined much of its own base, right? This faction that's now led by, or was led, I guess you could say still is led by the Clintons and Obama, has now passed kind of the torch to Biden and Harris. And sure, the leftist wing led by, Bernie threw its weight behind Biden and did manage to get a few policy concessions that I think we saw results from. Biden's, for example, has actually been a very pro-worker president, something that's been largely forgotten or dismissed given his other shortcomings and just the way the right has controlled the narrative. But I think here's my main point that I want to get at today. Between the media and the Democrat Party's leadership, it feels like the party would rather stay a controlled kind of permanent minority than risk empowering new voices that they can't fully control, right? And I think we saw this in 2016. I don't want to sound like a Bernie bro. That's not what I'm trying to focus on. But 2016, the party absolutely did some things to block someone like Bernie Sanders from really getting some momentum, right? And the Republicans, on the other hand, are winning, I think, partly because they allow these kind of new and rising loyalists into the fold. They take into account their perspectives and what their maybe more niche perspectives and thoughts bring about for the party. They allow those to evolve the party. I'm not saying that as a good thing. I'm just making an observation here. However, though, you can spin the reasons behind the Democrats' loss, but you can't ignore the reality that much of the left feels like they are lacking a voice. They're lacking a party that speaks for them. So when that happened, there's only one alternative for them. There's only one alternative narrative, and that says something that I feel like we're not fully acknowledging, or we don't want to acknowledge, because it could mean those pundits that are talking might you kind of like lose some power, and they'd have to admit that they're very, very, very wrong. Let's hear from Sam.
I think there are some lessons that the Democrats really must absorb from what is undeniably a total political defeat. They simply have to recognize that several planks of their platform are thoroughly rotten. Identity politics is over. No one wants it. Latinos and blacks don't even want it, as witnessed by the fact that they moved to Trump in record numbers. Trump got a majority of Latino men nationwide, and in some counties he got a majority of Latino men and women, even after everything he has said about immigrants from Latin America over the years, how they're, quote, poisoning the blood of our people, which is right out of Mein Kampf. A comedian calls Puerto Rico a pile of garbage at a Trump rally, and the entire Democratic machine and all of liberal media seize upon it like a nuclear bomb has just vaporized an American city, and no one cared. Identity politics is dead, and we have to bury it.
So I wanted to start with this clip because it's the perfect example, I think, of Sam almost getting it, but also just not getting it. Like, I'll try to make this make sense, and I'll provide some points, and you'll see throughout the episode. The way the Democrats currently approach identity politics can be divisive and alienating. I agree, clearly. Like, the Democrats, by almost every metric and measure, have lost the faith of the working class. And for years, they've tried to cultivate a political performance that I argue took an over-moralizing stance that left people feeling talked down to or excluded. That's the reality. And I still think this has been the dominant issue with regards to, let's say, like the entertainment side of cultural and political discourse, which is very different than your more informative side of things, right? The left's optics have been very, very poor, but it's not entirely their fault either. And I'll explain that later in the episode. I think that point will become clear. But what's crazy about this election is the outcome, considering we've had one of the most pro-labor presidents in Biden since FDR. So now, based on what Sam said and some other clips I have lined up, you might think he's right. I think this is where we start to see the appeal of this kind of like oversimplified narrative and these narratives that wrap up neatly instead of confronting the full complexity of the situation. Because the complexity of the situation, I think it's kind of hard to swallow. So Sam has chosen to skip the complexity, opting instead to react solely to, I think, the kind of present without considering the multitude of factors that have evolved over decades. And if you follow Sam's content from, say, 20 years ago to now, you'll notice that while his language has shifted partly, his core reasoning has remained the same. And that reasoning has lacked an understanding of the average American's reasons for a shift in political allegiances. And that's what I want to get into. But let's hear more from Sam.
Okay, there's one species of identity politics that had an enormous effect on this election, and most Democrats don't seem to realize it. Around 0.5% of American adults identify as transgender or non-binary. That's 1 in 200 people. And yet the activism around this identity has deranged our politics for as long as Trump has been in politics. One lesson I would be quick to draw from this election is that Americans aren't really into seeing biological men punch women in the face at the Olympics. And if that sounds like transphobia to you, you're the problem. Political equality, which we should want for everyone, does not mean that trans women are women. Trans women are people and should have all the political freedom of people. But to say that they are women and that making any distinction between them and biological women for any purpose is a thought crime and an act of bigotry, that is the precept of a new religion. And it's a religion that most Americans want nothing to do with.
So I kept this clip in because I want to clarify that this episode isn't about debating Sam's various claims about trans people. I won't do it justice, and frankly, there's other creators that will do more justice for that. My focus is on something else. something more long-term. And what strikes me is how much of this episode Sam spends diving further into the current trendy political topics of identity politics, while simultaneously insisting we need to move away from identity politics. Like, this is part of the contradiction that I'm talking about, and it's a problem. So let's approach this with a little less clickbait, you know? It's like, you're right, Sam. Like, identity politics has deranged our political discourse, right? But I think we need to be clear. It's deranged the right as well. And we should be asking why. It's one thing for it to happen, but why is it happening? We should be asking what structures are driving this and why it's become the dominant narrative that shapes people's sense of fear and disillusionment about culture, about society, and about politics. Because I can promise you, Sam, and anyone listening, the reason you are still recycling, or Sam is recycling these talking points after a decade, I think is pretty simple. He probably doesn't even realize this. And I'm not saying like he's like aware he's doing, but it's simple. It gets clicks. It's predictable. People like narratives that feel safe and familiar, that make them feel like they don't have to do anything about it. And this predictability, it brings in views, builds an audience. And ultimately, I think it generates money. And more than anything, it's a way to keep people angry and distracted from the real issues. Like the fact that so many people are struggling just to pay rent. The American dream feels like a lie. People can't afford houses, right? So now to both Gen Z and millennials, they feel powerless in our political discourse, not because of woke politics, but because of various events that have eroded trust in our structures over the last couple of decades. It's a way for us to all sidestep our discontent. Even when Sam tries to say identity politics is done, he can't help himself. He can't help but keep obsessing over it using the very rhetoric built around it. Does the same shout out talking points. And I don't think we can ignore that mainstream and like liberal media figures like, say, Ethan Klein, Barry Weiss, and Sam himself, they've embraced this woke narrative as a convenient talking point, a scapegoat for the lackluster political awareness that they have. Like, we have to question what ideological commitments this narrative is serving. Consider it, right? These are major voices shaping the cultural industry on the left. They play a big role in setting the terms of the conversation and promoting certain ideas as common sense, right? While sidelining many other people outside of that apparatus. So by labeling wokeness as inherently alienating, these mainstream pundits then are essentially helping to keep progressive values on the defensive. So in effect, they're essentially lending legitimacy to right-wing talking heads by reinforcing this idea that cultural issues, many of which have little to no bearing on people's daily lives, they're framing that now as somehow more urgent than structural issues like economic inequality or healthcare reform, which actually do have an effect on people's everyday lives, right? But to be clear, I'm not here to like wholeheartedly defend wokeness either. That's not my point. There are plenty of cultural moments where the left, by every metric, fails to consider the optics or the broader context of how their messages are being received, you know? So for example, if we frame men, let's say, as the most privileged and powerful political category, and then start, educating men to see themselves that way, it's worth noticing if this rhetoric is making them aware or feel alienated and unwelcome in, say, a progressive movement. So wouldn't it then make sense to rethink this framing if we actually believe that this group, men, is the one with the most privilege and political power, right? Let's also not assume that focusing only on worker issues is the answer either. After all, Trump made major inroads with young men, and their disillusionment isn't just economic. Like that idea, I think that the discontent of young men is all about economics. I think it's an outdated leftist idea. I'll dig into that more later, but it's outdated in the sense of not recognizing how generations' value structures changed based on their context. And we have a crazy new context that is the internet that I think has altered our political analysis, and people have not become aware of how we need to alter said political analysis. And that includes Sam Harris. So let's let him continue, though.
Okay, there's simply no question that Democratic moral confusion on many of these issues cost Harris millions of votes. So that's the reckoning that has to happen now among Democrats, and I hope it does. But the concern now is that 4 more years of Trump and Trumpism will prevent it. I mean, Trump is such a provocation to the left and to liberal institutions that Democrats could find themselves doubling down on all their delusions. Needless to say, this will be exactly what Trump and the MAGA cult want, because it will be politically suicidal.
All right, so this next part, I got to preempt it a little bit. It might sound like I'm defending the Democrats, but I want to be clear up front. I still think Kamala Harris, I still think Kamala Harris ran a just absolutely terrible campaign. She was an unpopular candidate. That's just facts. Well, yes, I think like gender and race absolutely play a role. I do think it's naive to think that alone explains her loss. I just feel the need to address people that had their tired and clickbait analysis ready in less than an hour after the election and have persuaded people of this. But Kamala took a number of missteps. Many. She moved to the right on immigration. She distanced herself from Biden in a way that missed highlighting how pro-worker his administration has actually been. She probably listened to campaign strategists who don't grasp just how fast cultural narratives shift now, which is partly why they simplify everything down to kind of outdated talking points. So what happened? Like, why did this happen? Because I think Kamala kind of framed herself as a kind of centrist war hawk and tried to buddy up with the Cheney family, who happens to be one of the most universally disliked names in American politics nowadays and culturally. Like, she tried to play both sides on Israel and Palestine and ultimately leaning toward Israel, which alienated people on the left without making like any converts on the right, right? Like, to voters, this just made her look like a slippery little politician who'd say anything to get elected, and it made her seem like she stood for nothing. Like, her narrative was just all over the place. So this is how you know I'm not here to run PR for the Democrats. I don't like the Democrats, but I also think Sam is still wrong in his framing of the Democrats, you know, because do you see how none of what I said had anything really to do with woke issues? Because wokeness is just one piece of the puzzle, and hyperfixating on that will not lead us to any informative solutions. It will just create more disillusionment, discontent, and it's going to lack a narrative that I think actually resonates with the average voter, because the Democrats have lost the average voter. So people like Sam, pundits like Sam, who are very centrist leftists, they need a reckoning. This should be their reckoning. But let's let them make some more points.
Okay, if you are a Democrat who voted for Harris, please absorb this. You lost more people of color than you ever have in a presidential election while running against Archie Bunker. Worse, Trump is actually supported by real racists and white supremacists, and that still wasn't enough of a problem. Who do you think your identity politics is for? You're really going to keep celebrating pornographers of racial grievance like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi? Should we just give another Pulitzer Prize to the 1619 Project and congratulate ourselves? You really think racism is the problem in America? And what we saw this week was just a victory for white male identity politics? That's how you're going to explain Trump's popularity at this point? Trump gained support from every racial group except white people, right? Where he lost 1 percentage point when compared to 2020. You're going to chalk that up to racism?
Okay, Sam, and all liberal media pundits out there. Do you see how fixating on Harris's supposed wokeness is a convenient storyline for critics of the left, but it glosses over the far more explicit and divisive identity politics actively wielded by figures like Donald Trump and his media apparatus now? Because Trump, for instance, like leaned heavily into identity-based appeals, you know, stoking, I think, many divisions around race, immigration, and religion, all while framing these stances as authentically American. And this created a narrative of, I think, resentment. something the left could actually seize upon if it, spent less time on the defensive and more on the offensive, which is part of my point today. Like Trump positioned outsiders as the problem, fostering a sense of kind of unity and superiority among his base, a shared identity politics that proudly defends so-called traditional values, traditional American values, for example. So his moral simplifications in us versus them narrative, that resonated with a public hungry for clear distinctions, allowing Trump's overt use of identity politics to kind of feel like a reaffirmation of cultural norms rather than an intentionally kind of divisive strategy, right? But here's why I kind of bring this up. Like Harris's campaign remained relatively neutral on identity issues, yet the right's critique fixates on wokeness as the kind of scapegoat, claiming that identity politics on the left alienates ordinary Americans, right? And I know this might be controversial and I don't have it kind of fully figured out yet or fleshed out, but here's my thinking so far is I think we need a leftist movement that embraces more charismatic figures who aren't afraid to bend the rules and go on the cultural offensive in a sense, while ultimately channeling these issues back to core economic concerns. And I think that's what's been lost. Harris didn't have, or Kamala Harris didn't have the personality for that. That's a hard truth. She didn't, and frankly though, most career politicians don't. The centrist Democrats definitely don't because they are more concerned with protecting their media careers. So I'm talking to the liberal pundits too, such as Sam Harris. But it's becoming clear that there's a kind of double standard at play. Like identity politics is considered problematic only when it's associated with the left. While on the right, it's normalized or even celebrated as the defense of American values. This framing is what needs to be challenged. We need an offensive against the double standard because right now, liberal pundits like Sam are letting the right exploit identity politics while subtly legitimizing it as a non-political stance. So even as it strategically mobilizes cultural divisions for its own gain. And this is part of the reckoning, I think, too, is this is where I was saying is this is maybe where you would consider it wokeness. Wokeness has also caused some of that in the sense of this kind of anti-American sentiment. We need a reframing so that we can re-romanticize being American because that is what unites us in a sense. And we have lost that. But the way to do that is not what Sam is saying. Let's let him continue.
Elon Musk never corrects his errors. Tucker Carlson never corrects his errors. Donald Trump never makes errors because he never stops lying. He's playing tennis without the net, and his fans love it. Putting your faith in deranged personalities isn't a viable alternative to having truly liberal institutions that you can trust and that can be obliged to earn your trust back when they fail.
So we're kind of getting to the part of Sam's episode where I think he's mostly right, actually, but the way he opens the episode, those previous clips, and the focus he chooses to show that his approach to fixing things is why I think it's fundamentally flawed. Because the reality is Sam operates in a media landscape where representations of truth often overshadow truth itself. So figures like Trump, Musk, and Carlson, they're not just influential. They become these hyper-real symbols, embodying a reality shaped more by internet spectacle than by substance. So their mistakes or outright falsehoods, they become absorbed into their personas, making corrections in a sense irrelevant. But why is this? Because their authority isn't rooted in being factually correct. It's based on performing as the kind of voice for many disillusioned people searching for a narrative that channels their discontent. So these symbols become projections, filling the void for those who feel unseen, right? And remember how I said the media plays a bigger role than it admits. Here's how I think that is, because becoming a performance is lucrative. Like, let's be honest, like to be a spectacle, to allow others to live vicariously through you online is the way to build a following. And the corporate machine feeds on that stuff, man, like crazy. Like the result is like spectacle figures who people forget are just humans. Like I feel like that gets separated with this screen here, right? They forget that. They forget how those humans have motivations that are ultimately will align with making tons of money. Like that's most of the time. That's what happens. Like we all kind of, I think, accept this at some level. Like this media spectacle is run by individuals, just like you and me, just like the average person. They're not that different. They're still putting a performance online, but they're still fucking human. And they're caught up in creating this persona. When we lean too far into spectacle, truth and accountability just fall away, all by the wayside, replaced by personality, which makes like traditional checks and balances just culturally ineffective. No one cares. But why is that? Because the profit-driven power structure is consuming people's discontent and selling it back to them. So Sam, it starts with you recognizing the role of corporate interests, even in fan-funded media. Why do these fans fund you? What performance are they buying into? Which part of yourself are they asking you to perform? What distraction are you being? Let's let them continue.
I understand how satisfying it is to find a new bully to beat up the other bullies who've been making you miserable. Okay, but the problem is this new bully is worse, right? This new bully has no principles. This new bully has no journalistic or academic or scientific conscience to appeal to. Whatever might be wrong with a person like Anthony Fauci or Francis Collins or any of the other doctors who have been demonized right of center for their approach to setting COVID policy, at least they are real doctors and scientists who have some professional scruples and reputations to protect among people who actually know something about medical science. RFK Jr. has none of that. He's just a cowboy taking shots at the establishment. The Joe Rogan podcast is not a substitute for the Wall Street Journal or the Kennedy School at Harvard. It is simply not progress to have a comedian like Dave Smith, who's apparently done his own research, interviewed about the history of the Middle East or the war in Ukraine like he's the next Henry Kissinger. All of this free access to information is making us dumber.
Sam, I partially agree with you, but once again, wokeness didn't cause this destabilization of authority of the media. This is what I'm trying to get at. Wokeness didn't do this. These are the structural issues I'm trying to talk about. The celebrity expert phenomena. It thrives in this environment by presenting charisma and contrarianism as substitutes for actual qualifications. But what do I know? I'm also just a talking head right now. And I mean, like, come on. Like Sam positions himself also as a PhD philosopher, yet he's still delivering, freshman level arguments on free will. Like he's also the celebrity expert that he's criticized. He is one of them. He is the thing that he's saying and criticizing in this context. He's the guy hyperfixated on wokeness. He's the guy driving this narrative. He's part of that structure, that distraction. So honestly, like fixating on the free will point, his stance on free will even sheds some light on why I think he's so fixated on wokeness. Because instead of tackling deeper structural problems, right? I think that's a topic for another day, but I think there's something there. But I think the real problem isn't wokeness. It's the systemic erosion of trust in institutions, which has been brought on by scandals, elitism, and the lack of transparency and accountability. It just so happens, like I'm not saying wokeness doesn't play a part in that. The wokeness and the narratives by the right have been the outlet to express that discontent, because I think people do not know where to direct their discontent because they do not feel they have a voice in this system to change it. They don't feel they have a way to do anything. So I think to restore faith in these institutions, we need structural reforms that make them more responsive and open, countering the appeal of these rogue voices that dominate mainstream discourse while they try to claim to be outside of it. Like Joe Rogan still claims to be outside of the mainstream media discourse, yet he gets 40 million views when Trump goes on. He is the mainstream. He is defining the mainstream opinion, the mainstream ideas. This is the reality of our current state of our trust in institutions. So yes, I guess, Sam, like you're right in a sense. Focusing more on wokeness isn't the answer. And that goes for Sam, too. Like, I think to rebuild trust, we have to dig much deeper. People feel economic discontent because they feel cheated. They feel lied to. They trust Trump not because he's trustworthy, but because he addresses their grievances. However, simplistically and wrongfully, I'm not saying they're right in when I'm saying this, but I do think we need to consider this where while corruption continues to get bailed out, Bezos buys up the Washington Post and pharmaceutical companies deep in public mistrust. Corporations continue to get bailed out. Political justifications for war are found to be lies. This is a slow deterioration of trust that has occurred for over 2 decades. I mean, more than 2 decades, but for people that are politically active today, this is something that's been happening and been having ripple effects. It's not something recent. And Trump has become the chosen voice of that mistrust. He is the symbol of the discontent, and we need to do better at analyzing that. And it starts with not blaming wokeness fully. Like, it's just silly. It's fucking silly. Let's continue.
Of course, I blame Trump and social media for how divisive our politics have become. Trump is what you get when 51% of a society just declares bankruptcy on core moral values and political principles and journalistic ethics and necessary institutions. There is no real defense of Trump and Trumpism. All his defenders act like his critics just don't like the man's style. He's just too crass or bombastic. Or they think we're worried about hypothetical things that might never happen. We're worried he might become a fascist in the future. And needless to say, these concerns are telltale signs of Trump derangement syndrome. But none of that is true, right? The problem with Trump isn't his style, and it's not merely what might happen in the future. The problem is what has already happened. It's the damage that Trump has already caused to our democracy. And it's the fact that he has turned the Republican Party into a personality cult that celebrates all this damage as a sign of progress.
Promise you, the damage was done long before Trump came along. Like, people like Sam seem to dismiss that, I think. Like the 2008 financial crisis, the narrative spun from 9/11, and scandals even like Enron's corporate corruption from decades ago. These events have left deep ripple effects across society, and the internet gives people access to become aware of these scandals. The average person is more aware of the falsehoods brought to us by the structures we live within, and the response to it by leading liberal commentators has been awful. It's missed everything, and they have, I think, actively chosen not to address them because it means hurting their pocketbooks. Because Trump's appeal to me isn't just about his style. He's right. Sam's right in that regard. It taps into a deep-seated desire for someone to fight back against elites, no matter the actual consequences. And with the internet, these symbolic victories carry even more weight, each one creating a new image to be consumed. So we end up with the cycle where public admiration floats toward a strongman, or these kind of like strongman figures who claim to subvert corrupt systems, all while building their own brands of authoritarianism and elitism. This is the reality. Let's get to the next clip.
And I have something that I really must say to Joe Rogan and the other podcasters who interviewed Trump. You can't have it both ways. You don't get to say that this was the podcast election and that these long-form conversations are incredibly important for people to hear so that they can make up their mind about who to vote for, and then take no journalistic responsibility whatsoever to get your facts straight or to expose obvious lies when you're talking to the most prolific liar on earth. You don't get to spout endless conspiracy theories about how our election system is dangerously broken and vulnerable to fraud. And then when your candidate wins, say, oh, well, Trump's victory was just too big for them to rig the election. No. How about realizing that there was nothing significantly wrong with our election system in the first place, and that all these concerns about fraud were lies coming from your candidate and his surrogates, and they were telling these lies in preparation for not accepting the results of the election had he lost, and you let your platform be used for that purpose by people who were willing to shatter our politics and even risk provoking a civil war out of personal self-interest.
So we're living currently in a world where Twitch streamers casually hang out with celebrities. Left-wing creators pivot right to get the bag. And algorithms subtly pressure creators into predictable frames of thought, often without them even realizing, I think. And here's where I kind of agree with Sam, where the isn't it great that we can have a conversation, that like little talking point that happens with so many interviews. It's an interview style that I think is outdated. It's stale. But I think we need to be honest that this fixation on positivity and agreeableness often comes from people who don't actually want change. They don't. They present maybe wanting change, but I don't think they do. They want the status quo. Because in a way, that's what Sam Harris is fighting for, And I think the right has mastered this tactic, kind of grounding their worldview in nationalist, hierarchical, and individualist values. Like they're right that this kind of cultural change is far less destabilizing than I think like left-wing positions, advocating for a, say, like redistribution of power. But I think we also need to talk about specifics. Like the Democrat platform doesn't accomplish this redistribution either. Like let's be very clear about that. But still, like what would have a bigger impact on our, let's say, economy? Medicare for all, getting money out of politics, instituting term limits, worker protections, busting up monopolies, or on the flip side, fixating on whether our movies are too gay or not gay enough. And this is kind of my point, is I think this obsession with cultural posturing on both sides is a distraction from the real economic issues that actually shape people's lives. Because I think the structures, in some unconscious way, in a lot of ways, topic for a different day, but I think a lot of it's unconscious, where they'd rather have us fixating on these cultural things, these cultural wokeness debates. Yet Sam is part of that. Like he's still focused on movies being gay. Like that's what he's fixated on in reality. Even this episode, is him being fixated on the same thing, just slightly to the other side. What is it doing? What is it actually analyzing? Nothing. It's going to change nothing. Anyway.
A podcaster who interviewed Trump managed to make it seem like all the bad things that have ever been said about him were the result of some left-wing elite media conspiracy. Right? To interview Trump or his surrogates responsibly would have required that you put them on the spot for any number of odious things he has said and done, and for things he said he intends to do in his second term, all of which are well documented, and many of which should be totally disqualifying in a presidential candidate. It's not enough to just turn on the microphones and have a conversation, and it doesn't matter that it's 3 hours long. If all you're going to do is launder the man's lies by ignoring them in the interests of maintaining good vibes, there is a complacency and an amorality to the way you approach this that was actively harmful. And all you people with Twitter files derangement syndrome, just how fair and balanced are things over there at X now? Is it the bastion of free speech you were hoping for? You think having a platform run by a manic billionaire who doesn't trust any of his own moderators to vet information, so he fires them, but trusts random conspiracists and lunatics, so he personally amplifies their lies to 200 million followers? You think this is progress? Do you think you'd feel the same way if a left-wing billionaire was boosting activist garbage to his 200 million followers every hour on the hour?
I think to really unpack these points, we need to understand how the internet has turned into a wasteland of endless information. I kind of like this clip because it really touches on something that I think kind of gets at the heart of this. So for example, like finding any kind of real or stable truth online is nearly impossible. I suffer from this too. Like I'm not immune to this. I want everyone listening to know that. Like I recognize that. Try to do my best to avoid that and like find some stable ground, right? But it's hard. It's not easy, right? And I think people feel this. So what do we do though? Do we go about trying to pay our bills and then wanting to make sense of the world? We turn to simplified narratives. That's reality. It's just easier because it's hard for the average person. They got bills to pay. Sam's got his bills covered. He doesn't have to worry about that stuff. This is his whole thing, right? And I think the simplified narratives that get pushed out are ones that tap into kind of primal instincts, like fear, like anger, and loyalty to our in-groups. So the right, I think, has positioned itself as rebellious or populist. And they've quickly realized that young men, especially, have moved on from millennial political framing. Take Zoomers, for example. Zoomers who grew up with the internet see the world through an online lens dominant. They bring the online into reality. Where the millennial generation had the separation of the two. They had a time before the internet. So they have this like balancing act going on. But Zoomers, they're taking it from the internet. The internet has defined reality. The hyperreal has become real in a sense. So when Biden talks about bringing back manufacturing jobs, it barely registers. Gen Z, they want to be content creators, not factory workers, because the content that's selling right now, though, is fueled by right-wing talking points. That's the economic drive there. They have the economic drive there. Elon Musk clearly recognized this when he reshaped Twitter. I'm not giving Elon Musk credit here for that, but I think it's like a recognition of that, what the base, that strong base on Twitter was. I'm not saying he's had success with it, but it's something he recognized that he is onto something in that sense, if that makes sense. And I think this generation doesn't trust corporations, the media, the American dream, or even their parents. They put their trust in individuals, the influencers, who tell them they don't need a 9-to-5, that they can make it as content creators or finance bros. Because if you do the 9-to-5, you're giving in to the man. You're giving in to those structures you can't trust. And you can't trust them because of the things I mentioned, the ripple effects that have happened for decades. They've accepted that. Instead of fighting the system, they embrace it, but they embrace it by trying to liberate themselves in this different way that is not really questioning the structure, but trying to find their place within it. We have to give them a reason to question it. We have to give them a reason to fight it. And I think we failed to do that. They watched their parents struggle. They saw millennials who are kind of like hyper aware of corporate exploitation. Like there's TikTok accounts that are all about it, about the corporate exploitation. They kind of romanticize it in the very millennial aesthetic way. And millennials have nothing to show for it. They're unable to afford houses. They're unable to afford rent. They can't even do that. Like they can't even start the family. They can't even do the American dream thing there. And I think Zoomers' response, especially men, has been to conform collectively while rebelling individually. And when that's the climate, you try to secure your piece of the pie. And right now, conforming to the right's cultural framing is more lucrative. It's how you do that as an individual. And I can't blame them. I'm not saying it's right. We need to recognize the state of things if we want any chance to combat it or change it or do anything about it. So what is the challenge? I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I want to find a way to convince people to resist that pull. We have to give them a reason to believe they can go against the structure, to go against that structure that they know is corrupt, but they don't feel like they can change the corruption. And it starts with Sam recognizing these things, but it also starts with him becoming more collectively aware. I'm using Sam here as an example, but this is just many people in the content apparatus, the media apparatus. They have to be willing to sacrifice a piece of themselves for some bigger picture. And people like Sam, I do not think, have had a reckoning with that reality. They don't want to do that because they don't actually understand the average person. They don't understand the average worker. They don't understand the lives of someone in urban culture versus rural culture. They haven't done that analysis because they're too busy performing what gets clicks, what gets views, and what gets people all riled up and angry and touches on their primal instincts. They have no interest in building anything. They have no interest in that. They want to feed their own self-image. It gets money. It gets money. But we have to start somewhere. Even if it means losing, you have to do it because I think it's the right thing to do. Anyway, that's enough of a rant. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope I said something insightful, or maybe I'm just delusional and consumed and deranged, all that good stuff, which might be so. Valid, fair. I'm also part of the problem in a way, but I'm also trying to not be part of the problem. Yeah. But anyway, tune in next time, but it's time for you to get out of my labyrinth.